I sat across from my mother, the air between us heavy with 27 years of unspoken resentment. I placed the certified letter from the Johnsons on the table, my hands perfectly steady. "You spent it all, didn't you?" I asked, my voice low and clinical. She didn't even look up. She just scoffed and adjusted her designer glasses. "It was my money too, honey. I raised you. That was my payment for your existence." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply leaned forward and whispered, "Then you should have read the fine print of Grandpa's trust before you bought that sports car. Imagine working 3 jobs for 6 years, barely sleeping and graduating with $40,000 in debt, all while believing your family was too poor to help. Now imagine finding out that while you were eating ramen and exhaustion, your mother was driving a sports car bought with the $150,000 your grandfather specifically left for your education. My mother didn't just fail me. She stole my future and called it payment for raising me. But she forgot one thing. I graduated in science and work in tech. I don't operate on emotions. I operate on data and evidence, and I just found the paper trail that leads straight to her front door. If you were in my shoes, would you forgive a mother who traded your education for a luxury car? If you were in my situation, what would you do? Type 1 or A if you would walk away to find peace. Type 2 or B if you would demand every cent back with legal interest. Leave a comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because what happens when the Johnsons hand me the original ledger will change everything. $43,214.78. I stared at the glowing digits on my laptop screen until the numbers blurred into a single jagged line of red. This was the exact cost of my ambition. For most people, a university degree is a celebratory milestone, a framed piece of parchment to hang in a hallway. For me, it was a death sentence, a weight I carried in the small of my back every morning when my alarm clock shrieked at 4 a.m. My pulse remained steady, a rhythmic 62 beats per minute. I didn't feel panic. I had long ago traded panic for calculation. I opened my master spreadsheet, the digital spine of my existence, and logged the latest interest accrual. I had worked 3 jobs for 6 consecutive years to keep this number from swallowing me whole. I remembered the smell of industrial-grade floor cleaner from my night shifts as a janitor. I remembered the way my fingers would shake from caffeine and exhaustion as I tutored statistics at 8 a.m., only to head to a waitressing shift at noon. My mother had watched this cycle with a detached, almost bored interest. Whenever I mentioned the crushing weight of the tuition, she would adjust her jewelry and offer a thin, practiced smile. "Life is hard for everyone, Sarah," she would say, her voice airy and unbothered. "I survived foster care and poverty. You're lucky to even be in a classroom. Don't be so dramatic." I wasn't being dramatic. I was being precise. During those 6 years, my mother's presence was a series of intermittent shadows. She would disappear for months, chasing a new social media trend or a new business opportunity that inevitably drained her bank account. When she did return, it was usually in a new car, one we couldn't afford, or with stories of parties I wasn't invited to. She claimed she only made $10,000 a year. She played the role of the struggling single woman with such dedication that I almost believed her. I believed we were poor because that was the only reality I had ever known. I accepted the student loans because I believed there was no other choice. I took pride in my struggle, convinced that my grandparents, the 2 people who had truly valued my mind, would have been proud of my grit. The silence in my apartment was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. I closed the laptop. My degree in science had led me to a stable position in tech, and for the first time in my life I could breathe. But the resentment was a cold stone in my stomach. I reached for a stack of old mail looking for a distraction when I saw a letter from an old family friend, the Johnsons. They had been the guardians of my grandfather's estate. I hadn't spoken to them since the funeral years ago. I opened the envelope with a steady hand. I didn't know then that the contents of this letter would render my 6 years of manual labor entirely unnecessary. I didn't know that the woman who had lectured me on grit and poverty had been watching me drown while she sat on a life raft built from my inheritance. I poured myself a glass of water, the ice clinking against the glass, a sharp, solitary sound in my quiet kitchen. As I sat there, the weight of the letter from the Johnsons still sitting unopened on the counter for a moment, I found myself drifting back to the foundation of the lie. The myth of our poverty was the air I breathed for 2 decades. It was a carefully constructed narrative, curated by my mother with the same performative flair she used for her struggling social media accounts. "We are one unexpected bill away from the street," she used to say, her voice trembling with just enough rehearsed emotion to make me feel guilty for wanting a new pair of shoes or a book that wasn't from a donation bin. I remembered the year I turned 18. I was working a double shift at a local diner, my feet swollen and my apron stained with grease. I had saved every cent of my tips in a shoebox hidden under my bed, hoping to put a down payment on a used sedan so I could commute to the community college. That same week, my mother arrived home in a pre-owned, bright red 2-door sports car. I stood on the cracked driveway looking at the sleek, impractical machine. It was a vehicle meant for a woman with no responsibilities and a significant disposable income. "How?" I had asked, my voice flat. "I thought you said the utility company was going to shut off the lights." She didn't even look at me as she adjusted the rearview mirror, her fingers adorned with a new cocktail ring that caught the late afternoon sun. "I made some investments, Sarah. I've had a hard life. I deserve something that makes me feel alive for once. Don't be so judgmental. It's unattractive." She claimed she earned less than $10,000 a year on her tax filings. I saw the documents when I applied for financial aid. The numbers were pathetic, a decimal point away from total destitution. Yet the sports car sat in the driveway like a taunt. She didn't use it to get a better job or to help with the mounting bills. She used it to drive to networking events for her social media business, a vague enterprise involving lifestyle coaching that seemed to consist mostly of her taking photos in expensive hotel lobbies she wasn't staying in. During my 4 years at the university, my mother's dismissiveness turned into a weapon. When I finally earned my Bachelor of Science, I didn't receive a celebratory dinner or even a card. I received a critique. "All that time spent in labs," she remarked, swirling a glass of wine while leaning against the counter of her cluttered kitchen. "You could have been building a brand. You could have been making real money. Instead, you're $40,000 in the hole for a piece of paper. It's statistically irresponsible." The irony was a bitter pill I swallowed daily. I was the one being called irresponsible by a woman who couldn't explain where her rent money came from, yet always had enough for a premium hair appointment. I was the one working 3 jobs, tutoring, waitressing, and cleaning, while she posted inspirational quotes about manifesting wealth to her 3,000 followers. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, but the skin was calloused from years of manual labor that my mother had deemed beneath her. I thought about the 3 jobs. I thought about the $143,214 I still owed the government. I thought about my grandfather. He was a man of precision, a man who believed that education was the only true inheritance. He used to take me to bookstores and tell me that a well-stocked mind was a fortress no one could tear down. He had died when I was young, leaving behind a legacy of academic expectation that my mother seemed to treat as a personal insult. She always spoke of him with a strange, jagged edge to her voice. "He was cold," she'd say. "He cared more about books than people." Now, looking at the letter from the Johnsons, I began to realize that perhaps my grandfather wasn't cold. Perhaps he was just observant. Perhaps he knew exactly who his daughter was, and he had tried to build a fortress for me that she had dismantled brick by brick before I even knew it existed. I picked up a letter opener. The metal was cold. I didn't feel anger yet. Anger is a volatile emotion that clouds judgment. I felt a clinical curiosity. I wanted to see the data. I wanted to see the exact moment the myth of our poverty collided with the reality of her greed. I slid the blade through the envelope. The paper crinkled, a dry, final sound. I held the letter in my hand, but I didn't pull the pages out yet. Instead, I let my gaze drift to the small bookshelf in the corner of my living room. It wasn't filled with the trendy, colorful paperbacks you see on social media. It was a collection of heavy, leather-bound science journals and ancient textbooks on organic chemistry, the kind of books that felt like they had a physical weight of authority. My grandfather, a man of structural integrity and precise speech, was the architect of that shelf. He didn't believe in gifts in the traditional sense. He believed in investments. When I was younger, during those rare weekends, my mother allowed me to visit his quiet, sun-drenched home. Our destination was always the same: a local independent bookstore with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a ladder that creaked with the weight of history. I can still hear the sound of his shoes on the hardwood floor, a rhythmic, confident click-clack that commanded respect without ever raising a finger. He would lead me to the science and history section, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Pick one," he would say. His voice was low, filtered through the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. I remember standing before a row of encyclopedias. I was torn between a book on the mechanics of the solar system and a dense volume on the biology of the deep sea. Each one was priced at $29.99, a fortune in a household where my mother would count pennies for a gallon of milk. I stood there for 10 minutes, my heart rate accelerating as I tried to calculate which choice would provide the highest ROI of knowledge. When I finally turned to him, clutching both, unable to decide, he didn't scold me for my indecision. He didn't look at the price tags. He simply chuckled, a dry, warm sound like parchment rubbing together, and took both from my hands. "If you have the hunger to learn, Sarah, I will never let you go hungry," he told me. He bought both, and then he bought 3 more. Total cost, $147.50. I remember the receipt clearly because it was the most money I had ever seen spent on something that wasn't food or rent. To him, those books weren't just objects. They were the blueprints for my future. My grandfather was a college professor who lived by a strict internal code. He saw the world in systems and outcomes. He saw my mother's chaotic life as a failed experiment, a series of variables she refused to control. But in me, he saw a constant. He saw someone who shared his obsession with the why and the how. He would sit in his study, the grandfather clock ticking at exactly 60 beats per minute, and talk to me about the importance of a university education. Not for the status, but for the leverage. "Knowledge is the only asset that cannot be seized in a bankruptcy, Sarah," he had told me once, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. "A house can burn, a currency can devalue, but what you have mastered between your ears is an irrevocable trust." At the time, I thought he was just being poetic. I thought his talk of providing for my future was purely about the emotional support and the occasional $150 bookstore trip. I never imagined that he was a man who translated his philosophies into legal documents. My mother always painted him as a miser. She told stories of how he refused to give her loans for her various business ventures. She called him cold-hearted for not funding her lifestyle. I realize now that he wasn't being a miser. He was a gatekeeper. He knew that if he handed her a lump sum, it would evaporate into the atmosphere of her vanity within a week. He had set high expectations for me, yes, but as I sat in my silent apartment, the cold light of my laptop screen reflecting off the glass of water on my table, I realized he hadn't just given me expectations. He had given me the capital to meet them. He had left a path through the woods, and my mother had spent the last decade obscuring it, stealing the paving stones one by one to build her own temporary monuments to herself. I finally pulled the letter from the envelope. The paper was high-quality linen, the letterhead of a law firm I recognized from my grandfather's old files. My breathing remained shallow and controlled. The ghost of my grandfather was no longer just a memory of old books and creaking floorboards. He was about to speak to me through a ledger, and I was finally ready to listen to the numbers. The bistro was exactly as I expected: quiet, understated, and smelling of overpriced roasted beans and old money. I checked my watch. 10 o'clock a.m. sharp. I had arrived 5 minutes early to choose a table with a clear view of the entrance. I didn't like surprises, and I certainly didn't like being caught off guard in a public space. My pulse was a steady 65 beats per minute as I watched Arthur and Eleanor Johnson walk through the door. They looked exactly as they did a decade ago, perhaps with a few more silver threads in Arthur's hair and a deeper set of lines around Eleanor's eyes. They were the kind of people who moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, the hallmark of those who have spent their lives managing other people's chaos. I stood up, my movements fluid and controlled. "Hello, Arthur. Eleanor." "It's been a long time," I said, extending a hand. Eleanor reached out, her fingers warm and slightly trembling as she squeezed my palm. "Oh, Sarah, you look just like him. You have your grandfather's eyes. And his posture." We sat down. The waiter arrived and I ordered a black coffee. No sugar, no cream. I preferred my variables uncomplicated. Arthur ordered an Earl Grey and Eleanor followed suit. For the first few minutes, the conversation was a predictable dance of pleasantries. They asked about my degree, my job in tech, and my apartment. I provided concise, data-driven answers. I told them about my $43,000 debt in a voice that held no tremor of self-pity. Arthur's hand paused as he reached for the silver sugar tong. His spoon hit the side of his porcelain cup. Clink, a sharp, metallic ring that seemed to vibrate through the table. He looked at Eleanor, a silent communication passing between them that made the hair on my arms stand up. $40,000 in debt? Eleanor whispered, her voice laced with a confusion that felt genuine. But Sarah, the trust. We were told you were using the funds as needed. Your mother said she was handling the disbursements to keep you focused on your studies. I set my coffee cup down. The ceramic hit the marble tabletop with a dull thud. I felt a coldness start at the base of my spine and spread slowly upward. What trust, Arthur? My mother told me Grandpa died with nothing but the house and a mountain of medical debt. She said I was lucky she could even afford to keep a roof over our heads while I worked those 3 jobs. Arthur sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to deflate his entire frame. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. It was thick, the edges slightly frayed, held together by a heavy-duty rubber band. He placed it on the table between us. Your grandfather was many things, Sarah, but he was never a poor man. He was a meticulous planner, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, clinical tone. In 2007, he established an irrevocable educational trust. The initial principal was $100,000. By the time of his passing, with interest and his final life insurance payout, that fund stood at exactly $154,212. I didn't blink. I didn't gasp. I simply stared at the folder. $154,000. That was nearly 4 times the debt that had been keeping me awake at night for 6 years. The trust was specific, Eleanor added, leaning forward, her eyes wet with a mixture of anger and regret. It was only to be used for your tuition, books, and living expenses during your undergraduate and graduate studies. As the arbiter, Arthur was supposed to oversee it, but your mother came to us in late 2010. I watched a single drop of condensation slide down the side of my water glass. 2010. The year she bought the red sports car. The year she told me we might have to move because the inheritance was gone. What did she say to you in 2010, Arthur? I asked. My voice was a flat line, devoid of emotion, the voice of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. Arthur looked down at his tea. She told us there was a family emergency. She claimed she had power of attorney and that you had agreed to dissolve the trust early to save the family home from foreclosure. We were hesitant, Sarah. We asked to speak to you, but she told us you were unstable, that the grief over your grandfather had caused a breakdown and that you couldn't handle the stress of financial decisions. He paused, the silence of the bistro suddenly feeling like a vacuum. She confessed to us, 6 months later, after the money was already being moved into her personal accounts. She didn't say she lost it. She told us quite casually that she had blown the initial $50,000 on what she called lifestyle investments, and that the rest was being used to fund her new business ventures. I reached out and touched the folder. The paper felt dry, like old skin. My mother hadn't just lied. She had constructed a narrative of my mental instability to a legal arbiter just to get her hands on a dead man's promise. "She told us you knew," Eleanor whispered. "She told us you were happy to help her." I looked Eleanor directly in the eye. "I haven't seen a single cent of that money," I said. "I worked 3 jobs. I slept 4 hours a night. I am $40,000 in debt. And my mother, she bought a car." I felt the first spark of something hotter than clinical curiosity. It wasn't rage yet. It was something much more dangerous. It was the realization that the woman who gave me life had spent the last decade feeding on my future like a parasite. I opened the folder. The first thing I saw was a photocopy of my mother's signature, dated October 14th, 2010. It was a sharp, aggressive scrawl. "I need copies of everything," I said, my voice as cold as the ice in my glass. "Every transaction, every withdrawal, every lie she told you in writing." Arthur nodded slowly. "I already have them ready for you, Sarah. We've felt the weight of this for years. We just didn't know how to reach you without her intercepting it." I stood up, the folder tucked firmly under my arm. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. The data was now in my hands, and I knew exactly how to use it. The manila folder sat on my desk like a dormant explosive. I didn't open it immediately upon returning to my apartment. Instead, I performed a deliberate ritual. I changed into a clean, structured blazer. I poured a glass of cold water. I cleared every stray item from my workspace until only the folder and my laptop remained. I needed a sterile environment for what was about to happen. I checked my heart rate on my watch, 70 beats per minute. A bit high, but understandable given the variables. I pulled the first document from the stack. It was the original trust agreement, dated June 12, 2007. My grandfather's signature was a masterpiece of discipline, every letter perfectly formed, every line weighted with intent. The language was unambiguous. "This irrevocable educational trust is established solely for the benefit of Sarah Miller. Funds are to be disbursed exclusively for tuition, laboratory fees, academic materials, and reasonable cost of living expenses associated with her higher education." I traced the word irrevocable with my index finger. In the world of finance and law, that word is a fortress. It means the decision cannot be changed, retracted, or dissolved. Yet, as I flipped to the next page, I saw the breach in the walls. It was a document dated October 14th, 2010, a petition for emergency dissolution of trust assets. Attached to it was a sworn affidavit signed by my mother. I read her words, my eyes scanning the lines with the cold efficiency of an OCR scanner. She had told the court, and the Johnsons, that I was suffering from a severe psychological break following the death of my grandparents. She claimed that my obsession with academia was a symptom of my instability, and that the funds needed to be redirected to stabilize the family unit and provide necessary medical intervention for me. She had used my grief as a weapon to pick the lock on my future. I turned to the ledger of withdrawals. This was the raw data of her betrayal. November the 2nd, 2010, withdrawal of 12,500 hours. I remembered that date. It was 2 days before she drove that red sports car into our driveway. She had told me it was a gift from a business associate who recognized her potential. In reality, it was my first semester of tuition at a top-tier university, a dream I had abandoned that same month because I couldn't afford the application fees. January 15th, 2011, withdrawal of $28,000. This was labeled as home stabilization. That was the winter the heater broke, and she told me we had to sleep in coats because we were too poor to call a repairman. I spent that month shivering, studying by candlelight to save on electricity, while $28,000 sat in her personal checking account. March 22nd, 2012, withdrawal of $45,000. Debrayers, labeled as venture capital investment. This coincided with her first failed social media agency. She had spent thousands on followers, professional lighting, and designer outfits for branding, all while I was working double shifts at the diner, my shoes held together by duct tape because I couldn't justify spending $30 on a new pair. The total at the bottom of the final page was a precise, devastating number, $154,212. The balance remaining in the trust as of today? 0.42 or 42 cents. She hadn't even left enough for a postage stamp. I leaned back in my chair. The silence in the room was so thick I could hear the faint, high-pitched hum of the LED light strip above my desk. I didn't feel the urge to cry. Crying is a biological response to helplessness, and I was anything but helpless. I felt a profound sense of clarity. For 27 years, I had been told a story about who I was. I was the struggling daughter of a struggling mother. I was the girl who had to work 3 times as hard because the world was unfair. The data suggested a different narrative. The world wasn't unfair. My mother was a thief. I hadn't been struggling against poverty. I had been struggling against a calculated embezzlement of my life's potential. I opened a new tab on my laptop and began a new spreadsheet. I titled it, Recovery and Revenue. I factored in the original $154,212. Then I added the interest I would have earned had the money remained in a standard index fund for the last decade. Then I added the $43,214.78 of student debt I had accrued, debt that carried its own predatory interest. The final number at the bottom of my screen was $268,910.34. That was the price of her lies. That was the invoice I was about to present. I looked at my mother's contact information on my phone. For years, I had reached out to her for validation, for a scrap of maternal warmth that never came. Now I was reaching out as a creditor. I began to type the email. My hands were steady. My breathing was rhythmic. I didn't use adjectives. I didn't use exclamation points. I used the only language she couldn't spin, the truth of the ledger. I attached the PDF of her 2010 confession to the Johnsons. I attached the withdrawal history. I attached my own debt statement. Mother, I wrote, we need to discuss the $154,000 you stole from my grandfather's trust. I have the bank records. I have the Johnsons' testimony. You have 24 hours to respond before I take this data to a forensic accountant and a prosecutor. I hit send. The whoosh sound of the outgoing email was the only noise in the room. It sounded like a guillotine. The silence of my apartment was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of the data I had just unleashed. I sat at my desk, my eyes fixed on the digital clock in the corner of my screen. 2 hours and 14 minutes since I hit send. My phone sat on the polished mahogany surface, a silent black mirror. I didn't pick it up. I didn't check for notifications. I knew that the moment she saw the attachments, the ledger, the Johnsons' testimony, the $268,910.34 invoice, the myth of her struggling single mother persona would shatter. Then, the vibration started. A long, aggressive buzz that made the glass of water on my desk ripple in perfect concentric circles. I let it ring. Once, twice. On the third vibration, I picked it up. I didn't say hello. I waited for her to fill the silence. Sarah? What is this madness you sent me? Her voice was high, frantic, a sharp contrast to my own steady breathing. How could you be so cold? After everything I sacrificed to keep us afloat. I was 21 when I had you. I didn't have a trust fund. I had to survive. You didn't survive, Mother, I said, my voice as flat as a heart monitor's hum. You embezzled. There is a legal distinction. I used that money for us, she shrieked. That car, it was for the family, the business. It was so I could provide for you. You're being ungrateful. You're being exactly like your grandfather, calculating and cruel. I am being exactly like the woman who raised me, I replied. I am looking out for my own financial interests. You have 21 hours and 46 minutes left. If you were in my situation, what would you do? Type 1 or A if you would take the loss to keep the family together. Type 2 or B if you would take her to court and recover every single cent of that $154,212. Leave a comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because what happens when I open the second folder from the Johnsons will change everything. I hung up before she could respond. I didn't need her excuses. I needed the $43,214.78 I had paid in interest for a debt that should have never existed. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in 27 years, I wasn't the victim of a tragedy. I was the auditor of a crime. The next morning, the sun hit my desk at a sharp 45-degree angle, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had slept exactly 6 hours and 14 minutes. My resting heart rate was 58. I felt nothing but the cold, satisfying weight of leverage. My phone was a graveyard of missed calls and frantic text messages. How could you do this to your own mother? I'm losing my mind, Sarah. I'm going to the hospital. If you sue me, I'll lose the business. Is that what you want? To see me on the street? I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I opened a new tab and logged into my bank portal. I stared at the balance of my student loan. 43,14.78. Every cent of that was a monument to her theft. At 10 a.m., exactly 24 hours after my email, I didn't call her. I called Arthur Johnson. "Arthur," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "She hasn't offered a settlement. She's attempting to use emotional manipulation to bypass the audit. I need the contact information for the forensic accountant you mentioned." "I have him on standby, Sarah," Arthur replied. His voice sounded older, tired. "But you should know. Your mother has been posting on her social media. She's telling her followers that her estranged daughter is trying to extort her for her life savings. She's playing the victim for an audience." I felt a small, clinical smile touch my lips, a winner's smirk. She was playing checkers while I was running a simulation. "Let her post," I said. "Publicity only makes the discovery process more interesting. Please send the files to the accountant. I want a line-by-line breakdown of every lifestyle investment she made with my tuition." I hung up and opened my laptop. I didn't look at her social media. I didn't care about her brand. I opened an Excel spreadsheet and began a new tab. I titled it Liquidation Assets. I knew her small business wasn't doing well, but I also knew she owned that red sports car outright. I knew she had a collection of designer handbags and jewelry, assets purchased with my grandfather's blood and my sweat. I wasn't just looking for the money anymore. I was looking for the equity of justice. My hands were perfectly steady as I typed out the formal demand letter. No adjectives, no insults. Just a list of account numbers, dates, and a final total that grew larger with every hour of interest. The hum of my computer fan was the only sound in the room. It was a comforting, mechanical sound. It reminded me that logic always outlasts emotion. My mother was a storm of noise and chaos, but I was the foundation she had tried to build her house upon. And foundations don't scream when they decide to shift. I hit print. The printer whirred to life, spitting out the pages of her financial demise. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever read. At 2:14 p.m., the frantic calling stopped. In its place came a single 3-minute video file. I didn't open it immediately. I adjusted my posture, took a sip of lukewarm water, and put on my noise-canceling headphones. I wanted to hear every tremor, every calculated sob, and every logical fallacy in high definition. The video started with my mother sitting in the driver's seat of her red sports car, the $12,500 down payment on my stolen life. Her mascara was artfully smudged. "You want to talk about ledgers, Sarah?" she hissed, her voice cracking with practiced desperation. "Let's talk about the 27 years of lifestyle investments I made in you. The food, the clothes, the roof over your head when I was just a child myself. I didn't have a trust fund. I had a daughter who cost me my youth. That $150,212, that wasn't your inheritance. That was my back pay." I watched her face, the way her eyes darted to the side to check her reflection in the phone's camera. She wasn't grieving a relationship. She was defending a heist. She was employing the Darvo technique, deny the theft, attack my character, and reverse the roles of victim and offender. "I gave you life," she sobbed. "And now you want to take mine because of some dusty papers from a man who never loved me? You're a monster, Sarah. A cold, unfeeling machine." I paused the video at the 2:48 mark. Her face was frozen in a mask of indignant rage. I didn't feel the sting of her words. I simply pulled up my liquidation assets spreadsheet. Under the tab Cost of Upbringing, I entered a 0. Legally, a parent's obligation to provide basic needs is not a loan to be repaid with stolen trust funds. I looked at the clock. The silence in my room was absolute, save for the faint rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, exactly 60 beats per minute. "Emotional labor is not a line item in a fiduciary trust, Mother," I whispered to the frozen image on my screen. I didn't reply to the video. I forwarded it directly to the forensic accountant and my legal counsel as evidence of her admission of guilt. She had just confirmed on camera that she knowingly took the money because she felt entitled to it. In the world of data, a confession is the ultimate prize. I closed my laptop. The sun was setting, casting long, sharp shadows across my floor. The storm of her emotions was loud, but my silence was becoming deafening. The forensic accountant's report arrived at 4:12 p.m. via encrypted email. It was 38 pages of meticulous devastation. My eyes scanned the line items with the cold efficiency of a machine. The final tally was exactly as I had calculated. $152,000 spent. Not on family survival, but on $4,000 luxury hotel stays, the $2,500 car down payment, and over $80,000 in marketing expenses for a social media business that had never turned a single cent of profit. The money was gone. Even after liquidating her remaining assets, the car, her collection of designer bags, and the meager equity in her small home, I would only recover approximately 30% of the principal. It wouldn't even cover my $43,214.78 student loan balance. My phone vibrated. I answered on the first ring, my voice a flat, unwavering line. "I have the report, Mother," I said. "I know about the $4,000 weekend in Miami while I was skipping meals to pay for my chemistry lab fees." "I was depressed, Sarah," she wailed, her voice cracking with the strain of a final, desperate performance. "I needed to feel like a human being for once. You were always so busy with your books, you didn't see me drowning." "You weren't drowning, Mother," I replied, my pulse a steady 60 beats per minute. "You were theft funding a fantasy. Here is the reality. You have until noon tomorrow to sign over the title of that car and a promissory note for the remaining balance. If the documents aren't in my inbox, I hand this report to the district attorney for grand larceny and fiduciary fraud." The silence on the other end was absolute. I could almost hear the gears of her mind grinding, trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. "You'd put your own mother in jail?" she whispered, the mask of the victim finally slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "I'm not putting you anywhere," I said, looking at my reflection in the window. I saw the winner's smirk in my own eyes. "I am simply balancing a ledger you've kept in the red for 27 years. You chose the lifestyle, now you pay the invoice." I didn't wait for her response. I hung up and immediately went to my settings. I blocked her number. I blocked her social media. I removed her from my emergency contacts and my life insurance policy. The cost of my freedom was $154.12. It was a staggering price to pay for a lesson in betrayal, but as I sat in the gathering twilight of my apartment, I realized I had finally achieved what my grandfather wanted for me. I was no longer an asset to be liquidated by her greed. I was an independent variable. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was clean, 12 noon. The timestamp on the electronic signature read 11:58 a.m. My mother had signed the promissory note and the title transfer for the red sports car. She didn't send a message. She didn't offer a final plea. She simply surrendered to the data. The car was picked up by a private liquidator 3 hours later. The sale netted exactly $9,450, a fraction of the $154,212 she had embezzled, but a significant entry in my recovery ledger. I watched from my window as the tow truck pulled away. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt the quiet, clinical satisfaction of a balanced equation. I sat back at my desk and opened my student loan portal. I made a manual payment of $9,000. The balance dropped to $34,214.78. It will take me another 3 years of disciplined budgeting to reach zero, but for the first time, the weight didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a fee for my independence. My mother is now a ghost in my contacts list, a blocked number, a deactivated memory. She will likely spend the rest of her life telling her social media followers a story about a daughter who stole her joy. She will play the victim until the credits roll, but she will do it without my grandfather's money, and she will do it without me. I picked up the leather-bound biology textbook my grandfather bought me years ago. I ran my hand over the cover. He was right. Knowledge is an irrevocable trust. She could steal the capital, she could burn the receipts, and she could lie to the world, but she could never take the degree I earned with my own sweat. I am 27 years old. I am an engineer, a scientist, and an auditor of my own life. My heart rate is a perfect 60 beats per minute. My hands are steady. My future is no longer a debt to be paid to a thief. It is an asset I own entirely. The ledger is closed.